Hey guys, I'm working on the E30 today. I just thought I'd give you a little update. I decided to change the power steering rack in my E30 because the factory one is known to be really have too many turns lock to lock. I think it's 4 turns lock to lock, so I'm putting in an E46 ZHP rack, the one with the gold tag. So I just thought I'd show you what the comparison between the two racks is like. The overall rack width is almost identical. It might be a little bit wider when you factor in these parts, but the actual rack body is almost the identical size. This one's about 3.2 turns lock to lock, and I decided to go with it over an E36 rack just because it's more linear for my reading and has a better feel. And I found it cheaper than an E36 rack, so I'm gonna swap that in. What doesn't work on the E30 from the E46 rack are the inner and outer tie rods, I guess. So, actually this one's easier to see. The actual threaded part is the same, so you can thread an E30 inner tie rod into the E46 rack because the threads are the same pitch, same length by the looks of it. The actual size is a bit different, but that doesn't really matter. The overall length of the E46 inner and outer tie rod is a little bit wider than the E30, so that's why you can't use the E46 ones. You can combine E36 and E46, E36 inner and E46 outer, or sorry, the other way around, E46 inner and E36 outer to make it work in the E30 with the E46 rack, but I decided just to make the E30 ones work. The left and the right boots are vented differently on the E30 and the E46. Basically on the E46 it goes through this piece. On the E30 it goes through this tube. So the E46 inner tie rods have this kind of channel in the grooves that basically allows the air to escape from the boot into this centerpiece. So essentially you just have to cut a little slit into your E30 inner tie rod to let that air vent. And then you can thread them on and it should bolt right in. I tried the rack bolts right in. You just need spacers on the top of the rack to make it properly fit. And you need an adapter to make the U-joint fit from the E46 rack to the E30 steering wheel. So you need an adapter for the piece that connects that piece to the rack itself. I'll show you that a little bit later on. Okay, I was able to get the inner and outer tie rod onto the E46 steering rack. Basically I reused the rubber boots from the E46 rack. I just had to cut off 3 ribs on the end, I guess, just to make it fit over the E30 inner tie rod like bushing that this normally fits onto. Then I used a zip tie to hold it on. You have to use the E46 boots because otherwise the E30 boots don't fit onto the E46 rack. Bolted them on. You can see the slit I cut and the hole that it creates. So that lets the air pass from inside the boot through the metal rod in the middle to the other side when you're steering the wheel. But when I put that boot on and turn the input as fast as I can, it doesn't seem to be ballooning or vacuuming or having resistance, so I think that's good. I'm just gonna put this last boot on, zip tie the 2 boots, and then put it in the car. So I fitted the E46 rack to the E30 subframe. The bolts slide right in. There's just a gap above the power steering rack to the subframe, which is what you need these spacers for right here. Those 2 on top. They fit between the subframe and the power steering rack. So I'm gonna put those on, tighten the bolts, pull the boots on and zip tie them. I just put some more lubrication on that just to lubricate it. And then I'm gonna bolt in the outer tie rods to the steering knuckles on both sides. So my car is a non-airbag car, meaning the firewall doesn't have to get modified to fit the E46 steering rack. You just need to modify this universal joint. Essentially it's too long from one end to the other with the new rack, so you have to shorten it by fitting these spacers here. Since it's a spacer, but it actually makes it shorter because it moves this piece further this way which means this piece gets reduced because it essentially gets shifted that way. So I'm going to be cutting these two out, putting in these spacers and these bolts, and hopefully that'll make it fit. So I cut out the old rivets and put in the new spacers. As you can see, this piece is now slightly shifted over that way, so the entire setup is a little bit shorter. Another thing you have to do before you bolt it back in the car is on the side that bolts to the steering wheel, which is coming out of the car, you have to slightly grind down right there so that this doesn't bind on it when it tilts that way. Let me show you a closer shot. That's where you have to grind it down a little bit, just a little bit, and that should stop it from binding once you install it in the car. Otherwise it'll bind when this piece is all the way up, it'll bind. So it'll affect your steering feel a little bit. So I was able to install the U-joint. It went pretty straightforward actually. What I did was first I pulled the top bolt on the right side of the power steering rack out and shifted that power steering rack slightly out that way, just so I can slide the universal joint onto the steering column first. I found it easier to stick a screwdriver in the slot of the universal joint just to expand it a little bit and help it slide easier onto the steering column. And then once I had that on there, I lined up the bottom coupling with the power steering rack and hammered the power steering rack in, which essentially hammered the joint onto the power steering rack. I went all the way to the point where the bolt lined up with the subframe again. The bolt hole on the power steering rack lined up with the subframe again. Make sure when you put it on that you straighten your steering wheel inside the car, and make sure you straighten your steering rack. This steering rack is 3 turns lock to lock, so what I did is I just counted 1.5 turns or 3 half turns from one side, and I knew that the steering rack is centered. I didn't end up grinding enough on the top of that first coupling there, so I had to grind off a little bit more once I had it installed. Basically, the way I knew that it wasn't ground down enough is I could feel binding in the steering wheel. With no weight on it, there was a point where it felt like it was catching. So I had to just grab my Dremel back out and Dremel it for a few more minutes on the right there. If that would focus. Right there. And then once I got that, Dremeled a little bit more, it turned nice and freely. All that's left to do now is put the 2 bolts back into the U-joint, one at the top there on the steering column and one at the bottom on the steering rack. Once I have that all done, I'm going to use some new copper washers and put on my old E30 power steering lines, and I'm going to bend them to fit this rack. The old power steering lines used to connect over here somewhere on the rack. The new ones are over there. So I'm going to have to bend the lines a little bit to make that work. I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so this is the high pressure line off the E30. There's 2 bends I had to make in it to make it fit. I'll show you how I bent it. So looking along it, this is the part that bolts to the rack. The other part bolts to the pump. So the part that bolts to the rack, this part here, initially it was slightly more twisted that way, so I had to twist it a little bit this way. I'll show you why once we put it on the car. And the line itself, this part, initially it was over there somewhere, almost in line, looking at it from the top. You have to bend it outward. I found it easiest to put this piece in a vise and hammer it to the position that you want. And in order to twist this, you put just this piece in the vise and then hammer the whole line to twist it. It's not too difficult. I didn't need to heat it up or anything, and for me it didn't kink. Looks pretty good to me. All I'm going to do is take some of this rust off the wire brush, and then that's it. So essentially the power steering pump ends up being mounted somewhere over here once the engine's all in. So you have to get the line from there, from the rack to the power steering pump, while going over the engine mount, which is right around here. It bolts into that hole. So if we look at the line, this is the high pressure, and that's the low pressure output. So you have to bolt to the high pressure line up to this port. So you bolt that up like that, and then that'll come up to the pump, while going over the mount, which is going to be right here. Had this line not been bent, it ends up staying something like that and more twisted that way. The reason you want to bend it is so that you avoid the engine, which is going to be over here. So you want to bend it out and out that way. This is generally what both the high pressure and low pressure line will sit like once the engine's all bolted up and everything's done. It's hard to see from the side. Sit something like that. The low pressure line doesn't really need to be modified. It gives you enough slack to, the power steering tank is somewhere on here, so it gives you enough slack to basically find the tank and plug into the bottom of it. It shouldn't hit in the way of anything because it's off to the side behind the U-joint. And then it doesn't hit the high pressure line, which is going to be mounted somewhere over here either. So the power steering swap is all done. The high and low pressure lines are now bolted to the power steering rack as well. I used some new crush washers in there. You want to make sure you use some new ones just so you don't get any leaks. Otherwise it might be hard to access, especially with the engine in the way. I cleaned up the lines with a wire brush and then just sprayed some clear coat on them so they don't rust again. And now I'm ready to drop the engine back in and then bolt the lines, that line hanging down there to the power steering pump and that line going up to the power steering tank. So I got the engine bolted back in the car now. If you look from underneath the car, you can see, where is it? Right there, where the high and low pressure lines bolt into the steering rack. Then looking from the top, you can see the two lines that come out there. Right there, that's one of them there, and then that's the other one. So the one on the right, that's the high pressure line. As I said, it comes over that engine mount right there and then bolts into the top of the steering pump right there. The low pressure line, how can we see it best? It's hard to see. That's the other line there. Comes up and goes right into the tank. And then the third line is from the pump also to the tank. So essentially the power steering fluid goes from the tank down into the pump pressurizes it, sends it to the power steering rack through that tube, and then it comes back after it's gone through the rack through that pipe there and up into the tank. I'm excited to try out this new rack whenever I get a chance to drive the vehicle. It should be a lot tighter feeling because it's only 3 turns lock to lock rather than 4. So the car should steer a lot quicker. In terms of the swap, it's not too bad. It's pretty straightforward, especially if you have that adapter for the U-joint and the spacers on the subframe. If you have those two parts, it's not too bad to bolt on. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching.